Now let's look at the micro events that take place during the cardiac cycle. We said that ventricles must relax. For that to happen, we have to have the T wave. The T wave is complete. Ventricular repolarization is complete. So we will start the ECG from the end of the T wave. So T wave is finished. Ventricular repolarization is complete. So now this will be followed by ventricular relaxation or diastole. So ventricles relax fully. And the fully is important. It's fully open. When that happens, the ventricular volume increases. Remember, we said when ventricles relax, there is more space. So ventricular volume increases. We have 3 arrows going up, which means it increases a lot. If that happens, ventricular pressure decreases a lot. So you have 3 arrows going down. The ventricular pressure is so low that it even falls below the pressure of the atria. Atria usually have very low pressure. Here, the ventricular pressure has fallen below the atrial pressure. So when ventricular pressure is lower than atrial pressure, AV valves open, tricuspid and bicuspid. When these valves open, blood can flow from the atria to the ventricles, and the ventricles can fill up with blood. And this movement of blood occurs down the pressure gradient. Now we go back to the P wave. The P wave, as we know, represents atrial depolarization. The atrial depolarization is complete. This will be followed by atrial contraction or atrial systole. The atria will basically squeeze the blood so that it can go into the ventricles. When the atria contract, the atrial pressure is still higher than the pressure in the ventricles. So atrial pressure is greater than, there's the greater than sign, ventricular pressure. Atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. So the AV valves are still open. No big changes here. Blood continues to flow from the atria to the ventricles down the pressure gradient. Now we move to QRS. The QRS is a very major event, so it happens in 2 parts. In this section, we will look at just when QRS begins. There are some events that follow. So when QRS begins, ventricular depolarization also just begins. This is followed by ventricular systole, but it just begins, which means the ventricles just contract just slightly. They just begin to contract. As a result, ventricular volume goes down ever so slightly. Slight contraction, so slight decrease in volume. We see that by a single arrow going down. As a result, ventricular pressure increases ever so slightly. There's your up arrow, 1 arrow only. When ventricular pressure increases, the ventricular pressure is greater than, there's your greater than sign, is greater than the atrial pressure. When that happens, we know that AV valves close. They make a sound. It's the lub sound. The heart has 2 sounds, lub, dub. So the lub sound comes from the AV valves closing. So there is no movement of blood. Blood does not flow anywhere, not from the atria to ventricles, and not from the ventricles to anywhere else. So no blood flows anywhere during this time. Here is the most dramatic event, QRS complete. This means that ventricular depolarization is complete. Ventricular depolarization is followed by ventricular systole. So ventricles contract fully. The fully is important because it has an effect on ventricular volume. Ventricular volume decreases greatly because the ventricles contract fully, there's no space, so ventricular volume decreases greatly, which means ventricular pressure will increase greatly. Now that puts the ventricular pressure greater than pressure in the great arteries. When ventricular pressure is greater than the pressure in the great arteries, semilunar valves, which is aortic and pulmonary valve, they open. SL valves open. You want to imagine them like champagne corks opening. And blood is now ejected, like champagne. Blood is ejected from the ventricles to the great arteries. Even though it's going upwards, it is going down the pressure gradient. This means it's going from a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure, from the ventricles to the great arteries. So now we have T wave. The T wave just begins, which means ventricular repolarization begins. Ventricular repolarization will be followed by ventricular diastole or ventricular relaxation, but this also happens very slightly because the T wave just began. Ventricles relax slightly. As a result, ventricular volume goes up ever so slightly. There's a little bit more space, so the ventricular volume goes up slightly, one arrow going up. Correspondingly, ventricular pressure goes down slightly. Now, ventricular pressure is less than pressure in the great arteries. There's your lesser than sign. Then pressure in the great arteries. So SL valves close with a sound, the dub sound. We said that heart sound is lub-dub. Lub is the closing of AV valves and dub is the closing of SL valves. All valves are closed, so no blood flows anywhere in the heart.